Hey y'all, so this is just a real quick video on how to mix your gouache to a consistency that tries to avoid leaving streaks on your bristol or your perg. I'm going to use carmine whole bean. It is my favorite red, and I'm just going to put a little tiny bit in my well. And then I'm going to, as soon as I can get the cap back on, I'm going to take my dropper and very carefully add water, just a couple of drops at a time. So I've just added 3 drops to this. And I'm going to use my crappy, trusty mixing brush. I really like the carmine. I like the hue that it has. And I use geranium too, but carmine is my favorite. So this is still a little thick. And the reason I know it's a little thick is because when I try to drag it up the side of the well, it's sticking there and it's not traveling back down. So I'm going to add just a touch more water. That's 1 more drop, and I'll do it a drop at a time just to make sure. There's a big old bubble in the middle here. See, now it's starting to flow back down into the bottom of the well when I drag it to the side. You can see really well with the bubbles there. I have a dedicated mixing brush so I can mush my paint all around. Just add another drop. There we go. Doesn't take a lot of paint, a lot of the actual gouache to make a good size amount of paint. You saw the little starting blip that I had there. So now you can see that it's clinging to the side of the well, but it is flowing back down into the center at a pretty decent rate. And while I'm still mixing to make sure, because red can be a little finicky sometimes, make sure that you have 2 pots of water if you don't already do this. You'll want 1 pot that stays completely clean, and that's the one that you add to your paint. And then 1 pot for rinsing your brush. And change your rinse water fairly often because you'll still carry pigment on your brush through to other colors if you're not careful. Hopefully you can see that pretty well in the video. It's hard to tell because I think I mixed up a touch too much. But what I'll do is I'll pop some over here into this palette so you can see it better. So if I take my brush and I drag the paint up the side, it's sticking, but it's still sort of flowing back down into the center really well. And then it will flow back down, and that'll actually work out really well because I'll have that for shading in a little while when I work on a different project. Rinse my brush. And the other thing I'm going to show you while I have the paint mixed up is what we affectionately call pushing the puddle. And it's how you get paint onto the page and keep it from streaking. How you spread your paint around. I'm looking for a different brush though. I don't have one of my... I clearly have a brush problem many brush problems. Oh, there we go. I generally work with 3 or 4 standard sizes, and then I can go elsewhere if I need to. I like to have almost all of my brushes are, there we go, Princeton Velvet Touch brushes. I like the number 1 round. I use that one quite a lot. I also work with number 4 round when I'm doing a lot of big block filling, and a 0 round, and when I'm doing lining, typically a 10-aught short liner. This one right here, that little guy, I like him a lot. And if I'm doing dots or something, I might use a monogram. But for this, just to show you, I'm going to use a number 1 Princeton Velvet Touch round. And I'm going to get it wet. One of the things that you want to make sure you do is make sure your point is a point. Look, I've already got paint on me and I haven't even done anything yet. You want to make sure your brush comes to a good point. And you can reform points pretty easily if you take good care of your brush. But in this case, this one's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. So I got the brush wet to get started. And I'm just going to reform the point real quick with my fingers. And I'm going to roll it in the paint to load it. Because we're doing block fill, I'm not worried too much about overloading my brush. I'm just doing a square. And overloading isn't necessarily a bad thing when you're doing block fill. So I'm going to start with this tiny little one right here. And I'm going to touch the page with the point of my brush just a little bit, just to get the paint started. And then I'm going to touch the paint. I'm going to try and keep my brush off the paper as much as possible. And I'm going to drag and move this puddle of paint around. And you can kind of do this about any way you want in terms of, do you line first, or do you fill and then straighten out? I like to give myself little areas to work with. You can see the raised paint here. My brush at this point has not touched the paper. I'm literally pushing the paint around. And the paint that I put on my brush was enough to fill this small square. And then I'm going to even it out. The big thing is to work wet to wet. So you want to make sure that you're trying to keep your paint as wet as possible, so that you don't have lines or shading. And see, I can still touch this paint. You can see it even out a little bit. And that'll be a nice solid block of red. And I'm going to rinse this brush, and I'm going to show you my number 4 with the big square and how fast I can fill it. My number 4 brush makes me really happy. It's got a pretty nice point on it. It's a little feathery right now because I haven't taken amazingly good care of it, but it also needs a bath. And I'll do that later. I'm going to start by getting it wet. Reform my point. And I'm going to fill my brush by rolling it in the paint. Just like this. You can see the paint on the brush. And just like before, I'm going to touch the corner. Just touch the paper just a little bit with my brush. And that will let the paint start to flow. And then really, my brush never touches the paper, even at this side. So I'm just going to push and pull this puddle around. This is a bigger section, so I'm actually going to work fairly quickly to fill this space. The perk of using a larger brush is that it holds more paint. So I'm going to continue to work and try to keep my edges wet so that I don't have lines. Add a little more paint. And it looks like I'm touching the paper, but really, if we could get down close and look at it side on, you'd see that the brush is not touching the paper. So I'm really just touching the surface of the paint and using the brush to pull it and push it around. I've got a piece of pigment that didn't mix, so I'm going to try and pick that up so it doesn't show up in the paint later. And you'll see that I kind of go back over a section a little bit to get it wet again before I start pulling the paint. And this helps keep it even and keep it from showing lines while I'm working. Because the nice thing about gouache is that it dries pretty quickly. And the surface that I'm working on is bristol. Bristol can take quite a bit of punishment when it comes to being wet. But the key is making sure that you're moving your paint in a way that keeps the layer consistent. Drag down, finish that side out. And once I get this all filled, I'll sort of go back in and even it up a little bit because it's hard to see on the camera, but it's a little inconsistent in terms of the layer of paint, the amount of paint. So there's a couple different ways that I can sort of tweak this. I can add more paint. I'm going to avoid that because that's unnecessary. I can also get my brush wet again and sort of move it around, but it's actually looking pretty good. Yeah, I'm happy with that. So that is how to mix your gouache and then how to push puddles. I'm gonna add a little more just for fun. I mean, this isn't a piece of anything. It's just fun to learn technique. You can see over here in this tiny square, there are no streaks at all, and this is all dry at this point. And this larger one will do pretty much the same thing. All right, so if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I am happy to do more tutorials, more one-on-ones as needed. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to send me an email or reach out. Bye, guys.